And Lea and I are good friends. Lea did her undergrad at UVA, University of Virginia, and then her master's at the Winter program in early American material culture. Is that right? And then, were you a fellow at the Cincinnati Museum of Art? Is that correct?
So I was a curatorial assistant at the Cincinnati Museum of Art. I was a fellow at Tony Williamsburg.
Yeah. And then
I'm back.
in the past
Sorry,
year,
thanks,
you've
William.
since joined the staff over at the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts down in Winston-Salem. So very excited for that. Thank you so much, Lea, for joining us today, and we look forward to your talk.
Yeah. Well, it is such a pleasure to be here with you guys today. I'm joining you from the galleries of MESDA. This is in fact a real background, but really thank you so much to the DAR Museum for welcoming me here and getting me the chance to share some of the treasures from our collection. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everything cooperates. There we go. All right, let's get going. Henrietta Johnston had been here before. 8 years ago, she stood here on the docks in Charleston, anxiously awaiting the arrival of her husband, Gideon. Then search parties had been scattered throughout the network of barrier islands looking for a lost Anglican minister who had made the unwise decision to disembark on a spit of land before the shifting tides of the Charleston harbor were favorable. The months at sea had become just too much. He had been found on the brink of death and brought to a nearby town, and Johnston remembered him coming ashore, alive, but barely. On this day, on the water's edge in 1716, she knew the outcome would be different. Her husband had been missing for 3 weeks. He had been on his way back to the harbor after bidding the departing rural governor farewell, when the boat was blown over in a sharp wind. All of the men escaped, except for Gideon. He was coming home today, but not as a partner and a companion. She was on her own. Henrietta Johnston had been here before. She had survived her first husband. She had been here before. She had provided for her family and household with Gideon when he was at home and abroad. She knew what she needed to do. She needed to create. Frances Lescott, the young daughter of a young Anglican priest, sat across from Henrietta back at the parsonage. Henrietta pulled out her paper and her pastels and quickly recorded the girl's likeness in soft lines. It wasn't perhaps her finest work. After all, she was living in a world that had been turned upside down. But she still placed it in a small frame and inserted a wooden board onto the back. Before she handed it to the Lescotts, she did one more thing. She signed and dated the spruce board. Today, the portrait of Frances Lescott by Henrietta Johnston hangs in the DAR Museum special exhibition, Pleasing Truths, Power in Portraits in the American Home. It's on loan from my institution, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, or MESDA, where it's lived since 1963. Henrietta Johnston was the first professional female artist known to have worked in the American colonies. She was the first pastelist of any gender in the same. Her story of survival, of creativity, it might strike us as unique, but she was one of many women whose hands left their mark on the material world of the American South. There's far too many to even scratch the surface in our time together today, but today we're going to use the MESDA collection as a tool to consider just a sample of their stories. MESDA is, in many ways, the work of women's hands. And since we are using those collections as a lens today, I want to briefly introduce the institution and some of the women who have worked to tell the story of artists like Henrietta Johnston. The idea for MESDA was born in the late 1950s. It was an outgrowth of the first wave of serious attention to objects made in the American South. Most scholarship and collecting to that point had really focused on the treasures of New England. Theodosia, or Theo, as she was usually called, Taliaferro, and her son, Frank Horton, of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, were at ground level in the attempts to expand the body of knowledge. Theo was a collector and an antiques dealer, and her son was the same, as well as a voracious researcher. In 1960, as the town of Salem was transformed into the living history community that continues to operate today as Old Salem, Theo and Frank saw an opportunity in a building that didn't quite fit the 18th, 19th century mold. This Kroger. Air-conditioned though it was, the sleek lines were not in keeping with the new old aesthetic. But the Horton mother and son, they saw what it could be, a museum to exhibit and share the blossoming body of Southern objects they and others had collected. So yes, under many layers of additions and modifications, Francis Scott normally lives in an old Kroger. One of our board members lovingly jokes that the only thing that could make it more Southern was if it was a Piggly Wiggly. In 1965, Theo and Frank's vision opened to the public, a series of galleries with period architecture salvaged from across the southeastern United States, filled with objects made and used in those regions. The original 7 states that were represented were Maryland, Virginia, including what is now West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And just last year, we expanded to include Alabama. So I suspect there's some folks from those states. I saw some Marylanders in the chat as we were coming in. So special shout out to you guys. The early curators and educators at MESDA were predominantly women: Susan Stitt, Carolyn Weekly, Sally Gant. And together, they developed programs that continue today, ones that expand the notion of what a museum collection can be. So starting in the 1970s, MESDA sent out young women to communities across the South as field representatives. They were tasked with gaining admission to private homes and convincing them to allow family heirlooms to be photographed and documented. Women like Pepper Potter, Millie McGee, and Birding Adams, who built trust and honed keen eyes to identify objects they were worth documenting, after which Frank Horton and his team would come in and do more thorough documentation. The result of their work and decades of subsequent contributions is an object database that includes information and images of over 20,000 Southern objects. This is fully digitized, and I encourage you to explore this resource on our website, mesda.org. In tandem, the MESDA team, including the ever-diligent Frank Horton, began to read microfilm of Southern newspapers, legal records, and basically anything they could get their hands on to capture the names of craftspeople working in the American South. Like the object database, this is now digitized and is available on our website. Like the object database, it has continued to grow. We are just south of 100,000 documented Southern artisans. And a side note here, if you are looking into genealogy of anybody who may have lived in the American South, this is an excellent resource. You never know who might have come up in one of these records. So please do check this out. But where are the women in these records? The documents for the craftsperson database was read without regard to gender or race, though the documents that were consulted were themselves not fully representative of the diversity of craftsmanship that actually occurred. But what this meant was that at least some women were recorded. And to date, 1,574. A full 40% of these women were needleworkers. We also see women as carvers, blacksmiths, silversmiths, potters, glass engravers, ceramic menders, button makers, umbrella makers, turners, inventors, plasterers, sculptors, gunsmiths, and cabinet makers. And the list continues on, even far beyond what's on this slide. Some of these women were more business women than hands-on with their craft, but we often give men credit as hands-on craftspeople when much of their effort was in the management of a large workshop. Paul Revere didn't personally make every single silver teapot with his mark, although in this portrait by Copley, he might want us to think that that's the case. Running a business is also a creative act, and these women needed to understand the craftsmanship that they oversaw. Still, the contributions of women are undercounted in the record. So much of their creative acts occurred within the household or in more informal production settings that don't get documented in newspaper ads or estate papers. Vastly underdocumented are the contributions of women of African and Indigenous descent, yet we know they were integral to the material world of the American South. I'm proud that the DAR Museum and exhibitions curator William Strollo, who you saw just a moment ago, are mounting the seminal exhibition, Fighting for Freedom, Black Craftspeople and the Pursuit of Independence, or for Independence. which opens at the museum in 2025. This exhibition will highlight the creations, contributions, and legacies of African Americans as they fought for freedom during the midst of the American Revolution and beyond. You are partnering with Drs. Tiffany Moman and Torrin Gasson, both pictured here, of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, which focuses on recovering the story of the creative work of people of color through the intensive reading of primary sources for these individuals. Strollo, Moman, and Gasson are all graduates of the MESDA Summer Institute, a month-long intensive residential fellowship. In fact, Strollo and Gaston met as roommates there in 2015. I got permission from Will about this, but here's a photo of the two of them that fateful year. This program fosters the next generation of scholars whose work expands our understanding of material culture in the region and the people who created it. And together, we can better represent the lives and contributions of all those who share this complicated patch of earth. We'll do some of that work today. With MESDA's three collections in mind, our museum holdings, the object database, and the craftsperson database, with all their potential and real limitations, we can start to reconstruct the many ways that women in the American South carved out space for their creative acts. We'll explore 6 of those ideas, 6 of those ways during our time today. First, working 9 to 5, professional female artist keeping the family afloat. Maybe she's born with it. Inherited creative practices, educational experience, teaching and learning to make, creative license, freedom, and the capacity to create. And finally, care and handling, the art of preservation. We'll start here with 2 female artists whose financial circumstances push their creative work into the professional realm. Henrietta Johnston is the earliest documented female artist working in the South, and we left her at home in 1716, finishing this portrait of Frances Lescott. But how did she make her way to 18th century Charleston? We believe Johnston was born in France to Protestant parents in 1674. Within just over a decade of her birth, Henrietta made the first of her many migrations, part of the French Huguenot community that fled the country after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. The family eventually settled outside of London. In 1694, 20-year-old Henrietta married Robert Daring, the younger son of an aristocratic family, and together they moved to Ireland. This couple had 2 daughters before Robert's death, 1703. It was at this critical moment that we believe Henrietta first picked up pastels, a group of portraits of Robert's extended family that are dated, were made over those next 2 years. And she started that habit of signing and dating her backing boards. And she may have been painting these portraits as tokens of appreciation for their support as she navigated her widowhood with these 2 young girls. We don't know who instructed Johnston in the art of pastels. Although favored in France, they were not as widely popular as they would become later in the 18th century. The poses she uses are rather stiff, in keeping with late 17th century formal portraiture. Over the course of her career, she varies very little from this model. Johnston's style includes large eyes that directly address the viewer. Adults are typically shown against a plain background, while young children are situated within an architectural or a natural setting. This painting, rediscovered by a collector in Pennsylvania in 1999, is a remarkable survival from this earliest period. It is likely a posthumous portrait of Henrietta's daughter, Helena, who died in 1704, just a year after her father. Henrietta shows her in a vaulted space with a checkerboard floor, leaning on a marble plinth that has the initials of Helena's parents. And above there is a funeral hatchment with the Daring arms. In 1705, Henrietta remarried to Gideon Johnston, an Anglican clergyman and a professional complainer. Well, in all seriousness, he was dealt a rough lot, and he did write a lot about it. We know a great deal about their life in Charleston because of his correspondence with his employer, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. In 1705, he was appointed the Bishop of London's commissary in South Carolina. This was basically an administrator to act in the bishop's stead at a distance. The family immigrated to Charleston in 1708. The Johnstons realized very quickly that not all was well in Charleston. Another priest occupied the pulpit of the church he had been promised. You can see that circled in yellow on this map. They also occupied the parsonage. Without a position or a home, the Johnstons scrambled to survive in a less than welcoming environment. And thus began the financial struggles that plagued their time in the city, financial struggles that Henrietta worked to mitigate through her pastels. Indeed, Gideon wrote to his superiors in London that, quote, "Were it not for the assistance my wife gives me in the drawing of pictures, which can last but a little time in a place so ill-peopled, I should not have been able to live," end quote. We only have one record for a payment for her portraits, £10 for a pair done in 1719. Now, by comparison, Gideon only received £50 for his annual salary. Her artistic practice was critical to their solvency. Henrietta even returned to London for a year on her husband's behalf. He couldn't leave the colony due to his extensive debts. She was not only a financial pillar for her family, she was entrusted with advocating on their behalf back in England. Her travels also gave her the chance to replenish her pastel supply, something she had a really hard time doing in Charleston. Most of Henrietta's dozens of Charleston portraits are of French Huguenot families or individuals connected with the Anglican Church. Among the earliest from her time in Charleston is this portrait of Marie de Beau, now in the Gibbs Museum of Art. Though the town was ill-peopled, Johnston tapped into her networks to obtain sitters. Already experienced in pastels, they were an ideal medium, fast, efficient, low in odor, and with limited mess, perfect for a household studio. And what a household it was. In addition to Henrietta and Gideon, there were their 3 children, a niece, a steady stream of parish visitors in need, and at least 2 individuals who were enslaved by the church at the parsonage. We do not know their names, but the labor performed by these 2 individuals allowed Henrietta that sliver of time and space that she could use to ply her trade as an artist. Gideon finally returned to England to visit in 1714, leaving Henrietta to face alone the outbreak of violence with the Yamasee, the growth of the household to accommodate those fleeing the fighting, 2 hurricanes, and a constant financial stress. Yet, Henrietta still managed to create portraits like these of Samuel and Mary Perlot in MESDA's collection. In fact, these are the ones that are right behind me. This was likely out of necessity, arguably due to her, and again, we see her consistent style. It's really lightly rendered here, and that's arguably due to her dwindling supplies and minimal production time. After Gideon's tragic death in 1716, Johnston continued to create portraits. And we know that she even traveled to New York in 1725, during which time she signed and dated several examples. But it was Charleston that became her final resting place, a city of people she had diligently recorded. Johnston's story is one of financial necessity. She was able to and had to carve out space for the work of her hands to meet the needs of a family in dire straits. Johnston is unusual in that we have information about her artistic practice during her husband's lifetime. The story of fellow Charlestonian Mary Roberts is more typical in that she emerges in the aftermath of her partner's passing. Like Johnston, however, Roberts was a trailblazer, the first American artist of any gender to pursue painting miniatures on ivory. And like Johnston, she created to survive. Mary Roberts arrived in Charleston in 1735. That's 6 years after Johnston's death, so they didn't know each other. She was born in 1703 to Thomas Williamson on the south side of London. And she doesn't appear again in the records until her 1725 marriage to artist Bishop Roberts, who had just completed his apprenticeship in the Honorable Company of Goldsmiths, likely specializing in engraving. In Charleston, Bishop Roberts advertised his copper printing business. He printed official documents for the colonial government there, as well as a range of landscape and interior painting abilities. His one major painting that we know of, a landscape of the Charleston Harbor, now at Colonial Williamsburg, was actually sent to London to be engraved. MESDA has a slightly later printing of that, but it arrived there at the printer in 1740, and it was still at the press when Bishop Roberts died in that same year. Mary Roberts was left with a family to support, including a son with special needs. She placed notices in the Charleston papers asking subscribers to her husband's print to pay up, and she went to the unusual step of actually publishing their names in the paper when they didn't. Mary continued her husband's printing business, but also added an offering all her own. Quote, face painting well performed by the said Mary Roberts, who has several pictures to dispose of. Mary could have learned from her husband, but the popularity of miniatures on ivory in England may point to a training that occurred prior to her arrival in the colony. Very few examples of her work have survived. The number essentially doubled in 2006 when these portraits of the Middleton family surfaced and were acquired by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Like Johnston, Roberts did sign her work, this time with an MR close to the sitter's form. MESDA is really fortunate to have one painting by Mary Roberts, this charming miniature of Mary Jones Broaden Keaton, which is set in a clasp. And I have to, the painting is tiny. It's about this big. It's really hard to, wish I could have brought it in here for you, but it's small. And this was probably done about the time of Mary Keaton's marriage in 1747. Indeed, all of the known Mary Roberts miniatures seem to date after the death of her husband in 1740. Which is a clear sign that her turn to professional creative production was likely a business necessity. Mary Roberts turned to what was almost certainly a skill she already had, the art of miniature painting, and she used that to supplement her work as a businesswoman, continuing the printing operation started by her late husband. And whether they were professionals like Henrietta Johnston and Mary Roberts, or more informal practitioners of art, female painters tended to favor mediums other than oil on canvas. There were important exceptions, like Sarah Miriam Peele. Pastels and watercolors require minimal studio space, are easily carried from home to home, and they can be put down at a moment's notice should other tasks pull the artist away from her work. We don't see female artists widely participating in the itinerant portrait painting of the 19th century, where you move from place to place to search for patrons. In most cases, women had to work within the opportunities they could create for themselves in their immediate social and geographic vicinity. Trades like metalsmithing and ceramic production required much larger physical footprints, initial outlay of materials, and ongoing labor cost than portrait painting does. And although there were women practicing these trades in the colonies and early United States, they don't readily appear in the written record. One place we get a glimpse of them, however, is in the wake of the death of a husband or a father, when women could publicly take the helm of a workshop. Training within a family trade opened up opportunities for women to leave their mark. Take Eloise Bedeau of Charleston, again with Charleston, who married San Domingo-born silversmith Louis Bedeau in 1811, a marriage that lasted until his death in 1827. A month after the death of her husband, Louise Bedeau announced through an ad in the Charleston Courier that, quote, she takes this method of grateful acknowledgement to the patrons of her late husband and informs them that she intends to carry on the jewelry business in all its various branches. Like Louise traveled north each fall to buy jewelry for the shop, but basic silver goods, especially spoons like the one shown here, were certainly still being produced in the Bedeau workshop. Louise advertised her wish to purchase 1,000 ounces of the material in 1827. She began to use her own mark, H. Bedeau. The Bedeau silver operation continued under female leadership after Eloise's death in 1837, this time in the hands of her daughter, Irma Leroy. Documented female silversmiths are rare. The MESDA craftsperson database only records 6, 5 of which worked in Charleston. Now, in comparison in the database, 174 women are recorded as weavers, making it one of the most common documented trades practiced by women in the 18th and 19th century South. Although they do not appear in the database, we know that sisters Margaret and Martha Prude actively worked as weavers in Jefferson County, Alabama in the mid-19th century. How? Well, they left behind these handwritten drafts, or they're essentially instructions for how to create different coverlet patterns on a loom. Also found with this cluster of weaving patterns was Martha's handwritten receipt or recipe for a green dye. We don't know how Martha and Margaret learned to weave, but they did grow up with a loom in their household. The estate inventory made upon their father's death in 1819 lists one, along with a harness, a flax wheel, 2 cotton wheels, cotton cards, and cotton seeds. Also recorded in this inventory are the names of 10 individuals who were enslaved by this family. Enslaved men, including Cato and boys like Samuel, may have raised cotton that could be processed, dyed, and woven into coverlets by Abigail, Millie, or Nancy, perhaps alongside the prude women. The family collection was given to MESDA, and it included a whopping 25 coverlet patterns, a scale that might indicate that the household was producing in excess of what they needed domestically, and probably offered their excess product to sale for other outside consumers. And when these patterns entered the MESDA collection in 2012, we commissioned modern-day weaving expert Suzanne McDowell to study and reproduce what the original textiles may have looked like. Here you can see a pattern by Margaret entitled Lady's Delight, alongside McDowell's recreation. Unfortunately, no surviving work by the household of the Prudes has yet been identified. Coverlets like these rarely include the name of the maker, and the identity of an artist is easily lost. Mary Adam of Hagerstown, Maryland, on the other hand, made quite well sure that her name would endure. MESDA's collection includes this earthenware jar, which Mary boldly signed on the underside. This is the earliest known work signed by a female ceramist working in the American South. Mary was born into her trade. She was the daughter of Jonas Node and wife of Henry Adam, whose own extended family were all potters. Although we have no signed work by Henry Adam, this slip-decorated covered jar is attributed to his hand. This is in the MESDA collection. When Henry died in April 1819, the local press reported that, quote, he has left behind him a disconsolate widow and 5 small children to mourn his early death. There was no time for Mary to stop working. Her family depended on her management of the ceramic workshop that she had inherited from her late husband. And by August, she was advertising potter's ware from the stand, quote, lately occupied by Henry Adam. Mary continued this operation until 1824, when she relocated to Ohio. So when did Mary make the jar in MESDA's collection? Was it soon after Henry's death, an act of ownership over her new role? Or was it something she made earlier in life with pride? It's a simple object. Only a gently swirling sine curve just below the rim is what serves as decoration. But there's something about this object that made it worth claiming as her own. And for now, it remains the only known example signed by this artist. But it's far from the only or the earliest ceramic objects by women's hands in the American South. In many indigenous communities, potters are predominantly women, not men. Take, for example, this shallow, low-fired earthenware pan with flared walls, the work of a once-known woman of the Catawba Nation. Like the pottery dynasty of Mary Adams' family, some Catawba families specialized in ceramics, carried on this tradition through generations of female apprenticeships. Women passed down knowledge of clay deposits, how to process the material, how to build those vessels with coils and fire them. The makers applied colorful lines of wax to appeal to their non-indigenous consumers. The Catawba were among the most powerful of the southeastern Siouan-speaking tribes. They were farmers centered along the border of what is now North and South Carolina, who had strong commercial and political relationships with Euro-American settlers, including an alliance with the Patriot cause during the Revolution. Early trade with places like Charleston was centered on deerskins. This amazing map, now in the British archives, is attributed to a Catawba map maker. It shows the city of Charleston there on the left in this grid-like pattern, and a string of circles representing the spatial and political relationship of indigenous towns in the Carolinas and Virginia. Besides being the very material used for this map, the deerskin trade is also represented by the hunting figure. You can kind of see that in the bottom left quadrant. Over the course of the 18th century, the trade in deerskin started to flag, and pottery and other objects made by Catawba women became increasingly vital for the economic success of the community. As early as 1772, they are documented peddling ceramic vessels door to door in Charleston. This one was found through the excavation of a domestic privy in the city. Among their best consumers were enslaved cooks, many of which were women. Clay pots like this one were ideal for the slow cooking of meat and vegetables, as it was less likely to boil over and reduce the fire. Stews made with rice and vegetables, based on African precedents, were often made in these pots. One observer noted that, quote, "It was a confident faith among the old ladies that okra soup was always inferior if cooked in anything but an Indian pot," end quote. The hands of Catawba women created the tools that women of African descent used to shape the foodways of the American South. In the present, Catawba women continue to create ceramics in the tradition of their ancestors. A similar pattern of women passing artistic knowledge through their family can be seen in these early 19th century baskets. They were made by once known women of the Cherokee Nation at or near the Moravian Mission at Spring Place, Georgia. They're woven from river cane, with individual sections dyed with walnut. And this pattern is double woven, meaning that it's different from the inside and the outside. These baskets were likely among those sent back to the Moravian community of Salem by Cherokee women. And they have been in this town where I am now since basically they were made. There are actually descriptions of this practice. Missionary John Gamble explained in a letter the contents of a parcel he was sending back to Salem, which included 6 baskets, each one of which has a number on the bottom. Our Indian sister, Margaret Ann Scott, sends these to the sisters. On the edge of each of these 3 baskets is sewn a piece of cloth, inside which is a little note from the sender. Whether Margaret Ann Scott created these baskets or acquired them from professional basket weavers in her community is not known. These baskets are on view at MESDA, but they're actually part of the other great collection we steward in this building, that of Old Salem and the Wachovia Historical Society. While MESDA covers 8 states, Old Salem focuses their attention on the historic town of Salem and the Moravian theocratic community that was established here in 1766. Among the most successful outgrowths of this community was the Girls' Boarding School, established in 1773 for Moravian girls and expanded to welcome non-Moravians in 1804, and this continues to operate today. Several young women from the Cherokee Nation were sent to Salem as students. They were sent by their parents to learn key skills that might help them navigate the collision of cultures inherent in the onslaught of white settlement. These included the study of arts like ornamental needlework, considered marks of refinement in Western culture. In the first decades of the Young Republic, female academies like Salem flourished. Included in the curriculum, often at an additional cost, was training in ornamental needlework. And thanks to the meticulous record keeping of the Moravians, we actually know what some of these Cherokee women were learning. Women like Sally Ridge, the daughter of Chief Major Ridge, and his wife, Susanna. Sally arrived in Salem in 1826, and we have a portrait of her from this time, done by resident portrait painter Daniel Welfare, and at the request of Chief Ridge. In the student records, which I've kind of highlighted here on the right side, we see that Sally, in addition to other academic subjects that everybody was taking, also took music and ornamental needlework. She was charged for that class, as well as for the materials purchased for special projects, including embroidery ribbon, chenille silk thread, and Italian crepe. Although, as far as we know, nothing from Sally Ridge survives, the silk-on-silk embroidery made by Minerva Ann Hurd of Tennessee, another Salem student in the 1820s, it might be representative of the type of thing that Sally would have made while she was a student at Salem. The quality of the work the young women created at Salem and at female academies across the United States was nothing short of extraordinary. This finely executed silk embroidery of an oleander flower is one of my favorites. On the back, it's inscribed from students in Miss Sally Fetter's embroidery class to the school inspector. Sally Fetter was an accomplished needleworker from the Moravian community of Lidditz, Pennsylvania. By the time she led these girls in this project, she had been appointed the head teacher at Salem. The embroidered flowers in Miss Fetter's class that were done by Miss Fetter's class is a pretty advanced needlework project. One of the most iconic and fundamental products of women's hands were samplers. Samplers are small sections of woven textile, usually linen, upon which a young needlework artist practiced various types of stitches, some of which could be used for practical purposes, like marking linens, and others that could be used for more advanced projects down the line. They usually include one alphabet, numbers, and often the name and the age of the girl. And some of them were done by very young hands. These two linen samplers were made in Hopkinsville, Kentucky in 1847 under the instruction of Nancy Lopspick by two sisters, 13-year-old Margaretta and Jane Ellen Gant. Their teacher was widowed in 1832. She had 6 children to support. Like Henrietta Johnston and Mary Roberts, Lopspick turned to her experience in art to find a way forward. And she taught Kentucky girls like Margaretta and Jane Ellen for 30 years. With skills learned at academies under the tuition of professional women or at home, women had the ability and necessity to continue plying their needle for the remainder of their lives. The large-scale samplers and elaborate silk needlework pictures tended to be projects of youth, but another canvas, so to speak, was favored by women throughout stages of life: quilts and counterpanes. As we turn towards this lifetime of creativity, we will consider how that creativity was possible in the context of Southern households. Now, there are some women in the 19th century, and probably to the present too, it's not my specialization, who I like to call serial quilters. And some of you might consider yourself a serial quilter. These women were so prolific with their scissors and their needles that despite the ravages of time, more than a handful of their works, of their hands, have survived for us to enjoy today. Mary Clayton Taylor is one of those serial quilters, and MESDA is fortunate to have 2 of her 4 known quilts in our collection. The others are in the Telfair Museum in Savannah and the International Quilt Museum. Mary Taylor's 1803 chintz applique quilt is the oldest dated quilt yet identified from Georgia. It held another superlative for the maker. It was dedicated in cross stitches to her firstborn son, Alexander, age 3. What did little Alexander think of this bed covering? It's full-sized, nearly 8 feet square, and it surely drowned the boy in cotton fabrics. This wasn't something that he would age out of, but rather age with. Mary chose to select elements from a pattern popular with 19th century quilt makers in America, this English print from the 1780s that features these various birds of prey. In her later quilts, which she created in the 1820s for her grandsons, Mary once again isolated fantastical winged creatures to populate her bed covering. Whimsical and evocative, the collage landscape of a quilt can be a place ripe for the imagination of a young child. Taylor was born in North Carolina to Scottish parents in 1774. She moved throughout the Carolinas and the Caribbean until her marriage to merchant William Taylor of Savannah. The Taylor household was a large and prosperous one, and it was made possible through the enslavement of between 2 and 8 individuals for each year of their marriage. These women enslaved in this household may have had a role in creating these quilts, but through their labor, they certainly created that open time that Taylor could have used to devote to such intricate textiles, and likely carried out the daily care that such objects needed to survive into the present. Mary Taylor's quilt has been at MESDA for quite a while, but the collection is constantly evolving and growing. And I mentioned at the start of our time together the women who fanned out across the South in the 1970s to document objects for our object database. And this work continues to the present. In fact, just last year, they identified a wonderful circa 1840 to 1850 pieced quilt from Chambers County, Alabama. The owner not only agreed to share her information on the object, she placed it on loan with us. It, along with 30 other quilts and counterpanes from our collection, will be on view starting next March at the North Carolina Museum of Art, part of the exhibition Layered Legacies. 2 of Mary Taylor's quilts will also be featured. So if you happen to be in Raleigh, I hope that you'll come by to see these masterpieces of women's hands. Writing an exhibition catalog is a prime reason to dig into research on an object. So this Alabama quilt was immediately under the microscope, so to speak. It is in a variation of the challenging compass rose pattern with 32-point stars in a grid divided by bands of glazed chintz. The chintz that looks like a medallion turns out to have been a favorite of quilters. Some chintzes were actually specially printed for use by quilters. And I've managed to find this exact pattern on a total of 3 Southern quilts and counting. The whole of this quilt was quilted in a tight fan pattern, and it survived in remarkably good condition. The quilt was made, as I said, circa 1840 to 1850 in the household of Priscilla and Aisha Metters, later Farrell Taylor, and is inscribed with her name in ink on the reverse. Priscilla was probably too young to have made this quilt alone. It probably involved her mother, Rachel Metters. Priscilla's father, Washington Metters, was a planter and an enslaver. He died when Priscilla was only 3 years old. Now, death generates a great deal of paperwork, now and in the past. A veritable mountain of court records documenting the Washington Metters estate survives, and reveals a household dependent on the labor of enslaved families that included 30 individuals. The intersecting worlds that they had played out in the creation and care of objects like Priscilla's quilt. About the time of Priscilla's birth, a couple enslaved by the Metters family named Richard and Hannah welcomed their daughter, Margaret. We don't know if mother and daughter, Hannah and Margaret, worked in the house or in the fields, but their lives were entwined with that of their enslavers, the Metters. When the widow Rachel Metters decided to move the family to Claiborne Parish, Louisiana, Margaret and her family were taken as well. When they gained their freedom, Richard and Margaret began using Metters, sometimes spelled Meadows, as their surname. And when they died, they were buried in the same cemetery as Priscilla's family. A faithful search for information on Richard Metters connected us with one of his living descendants, Arlene Green. A diligent genealogist, Arlene had traced her ancestry back to Claiborne Parish and Richard Metters' family, but the silence of the archive had stymied her efforts to document their earlier experiences. It was through the medium of this pieced quilt that our 2 research projects converged. The Richard and Margaret Metters and her family were the same individuals enslaved by Washington Metters and his estate. Arlene Green and her daughter, Chelsea Caskey, flew to Winston-Salem in early June of this year, and because they wanted to see this cool person. And for hours, we hovered around this bed covering, looking at the construction and the fabrics and wear. And the conversation actually turned to more recent past. Arlene's aunt was a talented needleworker who made quite a few quilts with fellow residents of her retirement community. And those quilts are objects that Arlene and her daughter now cherish themselves. In an email afterwards, Chelsea shared how it had been, quote, a monumental experience to be in the same room as the quilt that belonged to our forefathers. There's so much care and craftsmanship, history, and life that went into this quilt. Now, as I stretched out my hands to type a reply, my immediate instinct was to correct Chelsea. This quilt really belonged to Priscilla. It's written in ink on the back of it. But Chelsea is right. I had bought into this quilt's myth. The quilt may have Priscilla's name on the reverse, but it belonged just as much to Richard, to Margaret, and to their family. And today it serves as this really important material link between Arlene, Chelsea, and their ancestors. There is a glaring gap in the MESDA collection and in many collections with pre-Civil War Southern decorative arts, objects that can be confidently attributed to individual Black women, whether free or enslaved. We know that this is an inaccurate reflection of the true nature of craftsmanship. There were skilled women of color contributing their artistry to the material world around them. Women like Irena, who's documented in the MESDA craftsperson database. Irena, originally from Virginia, self-emancipated from Salisbury, North Carolina in 1824. Her enslaver, William Howard, published this description in a local paper. He wrote, quote, "She is tall and slender made, of dark complexion, walking a little stooping. Her hands are very much stained with blue dye." Irena was a dyer by trade, possibly using indigo to impart that vivid blue into fibers and into her hands. Irena's hands created on behalf of her enslaver. Her skill as a dyer may not have been something that she learned by choice, but she had agency, and she used those blue-stained hands to pack up her clothes, open that door, and head into the night, hopefully towards freedom. And we don't know if she was successful on that journey. Now, none of the objects that I've shown you today would have survived without someone caring about them. And as you might suspect, women are often the ones who care. Take this cord cutter. If not the oldest, it is one of the oldest surviving pieces of Southern furniture. It was made near Jamestown, Virginia, about 1640. And for generations, it passed from woman to woman through a family. They were the keepers. We find women's hands in little notes tucked into books, inscribed onto quilts, pasted onto the back of furniture. Lucy Jones described this dressing table as her pride and joy, and she wanted to make sure that her family treasured it as much as she did. Or Henrietta Johnston. We can go back to that day in 1716, still in mourning, when she took that spruce board in hand and inscribed her name, Henrietta Johnston. Henrietta Johnston made this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lea, for that presentation. If you have questions for Lea, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section. Sarah and I will be going through those and offering them up to Lea. I want to start with just how, I was surprised by the number that you offered at the beginning. So that 1,574 makers, female makers identified, either by name or by reference, right? I usually think of women as being involved heavily in the needleworking, like you mentioned. There's about 40% as needleworkers and doing art, but it sounds like there's a lot more involved in other trades. So one of the things I was wondering is how common do you think it might have been for someone to walk into a trade shop in the late 18th century, early 19th century in places like Charleston or Philadelphia and see a female craftsperson at work?
I think in Charleston, quite common actually. Charleston was a huge center of wealth and industry in the American South, especially pre-revolutionary South. Mm-hmm. And like I said, 5 out of 6 known Southern female silversmiths were in Charleston. And there's certain industries that you would probably expect to see a female person standing behind the counter. Millinery, for example, quite a few umbrella makers, kind of these very small, intricate crafts tend to show up more than others. But yeah, no, absolutely. It's more than I think we realize.
Yeah. We've got a couple questions starting to roll in. I'm gonna go with this one here first. Someone is asking, they say, wonderful talk, by the way. And are there any female tailors on your list? If we're gonna, I often think of women as mantua makers, dressmakers. But what about working in a tailor shop?
No, I don't actually know. I would not be surprised by that, though. But what I can say is that if you go to our object database or to our craftsperson database, and you can select the status, there's a little drop-down menu, and you can select sort of smaller groups like, for example, female artisans. Then you can select trade and select tailors. So no matter which trade you're interested in learning about, there's an easy way to kind of hone in on that. But I don't know off the head.
Yeah. Kind of keeping with the needlework and thinking about the quilts, especially those made on plantations or farms with enslaved labor. How much do you think enslaved labor is working on those versus the free people at the house?
I think that it is very much a case-by-case basis. So for example, in the upcoming exhibit that we're doing, we feature a group of quilts from the Palmer and Marion families of South Carolina. And we've really been thinking about them as collaborative projects with enslaved women in the household. But we actually then discovered quite a few diaries and letters that talk about women of the household and surrounding friends coming in and doing these quilting bees, where at least in these letters, they're not talking about enslaved individuals in the room for that. But that is one family, and that's one experience. And so, thinking about how we leave that space open for the presence of enslaved women and their hands in quilts, whether that's Priscilla's or the Palmer's quilts, I think it's good and wise to do so, because we simply don't know. And as I said, their contributions to how the household is functioning and the production of wealth means that they're quite tightly tied into the production of these quilts as well. So, yeah. I wish we knew more. There is the catalog for Layered Legacies. There's a essay by Dr. Lea Brown. She's at East Carolina University, and she's exploring that very topic.
And someone actually was just asking about the Layered Legacies quilt exhibit. Can you tell us a little bit more about where it's going to be and where we can find the catalog, and kind of a little bit more about that exhibition?
Sure. So this is a partnership with the North Carolina Museum of Art, and they have a wonderful collection, but they don't have a quilt collection. And they really, it's a compelling part of the experience of North Carolina art and Southern art in general. And we have an amazing quilt collection, but quilts take up a lot of room and are a challenge to exhibit. If you've been to a DAR Museum quilt exhibit, you've seen what an undertaking it is. So we're putting our two powers together. We're bringing the quilts and intellectual information, and they're helping us by sharing it with the public. So this will be in Raleigh, North Carolina. It opens up in early March. I don't know the exact scope of the run, but the quilt catalog will be coming out in tandem with that. And it'll be available there. It'll be available here at MESDA and probably online as well. It's about 200 pages. It's beautifully illustrated. And we're working on the final proofs right now. So I can tell you I'm excited. It's going to be good.
That cover image looked really good. I like that.
Thanks.
That exhibition. It's going to be fun. I can't wait to get down to North Carolina and check it out. Yeah. We got a textile related question. This one, one of our viewers is saying they remember hearing that men made women's corsets. Historically, were there ever women who made them at home or commercially?
That is a fabulous question, but I do not know the answer to that, unfortunately. There may be something in the craftsperson database that points to that. Mantua makers, milliners, they're creating a lot of the structures that go with it. I know that there in the database, there is a wire worker who I believe was creating wires that help with the shape of garments and also with hats. But in terms of corsets in particular, I don't know.
Yeah. That's a great question. We will be having, I'm going to do a little quick plug for the DAR here. The DAR Museum's next exhibition, which opens next year in March of 2024, is on sewing in America, and it details the kind of the impact and the scope of what women or people often sewed or what was required of them. Our costume textile curator, Alden O'Brien, is doing fantastic work on that. And, I'll reach out to her and see if we can't get that in our comments when we post this on YouTube later. So hopefully we'll get around to that. Let's do one or two more questions. I've got another one here. This is from another viewer. Michael is asking, when did you start your research on women craftspeople in the South, and what inspired your research? Maybe you can also just let us know kind of what MESDA's legacy is with that. We've talked about some of the assistants who helped Frank with that initial research.
So I've always been really interested in women as artists, just really from the get-go. I'm always interested in recovering people's memory And I think that that's a really powerful thing that objects can do, especially for people who are underrepresented in the historical record, which is true of women. And so while this particular project, y'all contacted me about a year ago about this. So I've been working on this for about a year, but it's not something that begins or ends. It's a continuum. MESDA's legacy, because of the craftsperson database, means that we've documented individuals, but we're always interested in growing our representation and what we know. So it's a journey.
It is. The last one I kind of want to throw out there, and I think this is more just of a thought than an actual question. The Mary Adams pot that you talked about, that's the only one that is known to have her name on it. Is that right? Is that what I heard?
Yeah.
How much more of that is going on out there? Like, how many things are we coming across that we don't actually know that women put their hands on? Like, that their craft is actually more prevalent than we realize. Are we finding more and more of that? Is that, what are your thoughts?
I think with paintings, there's a higher chance that something's going to be signed. Occasionally with textiles, you'll see a name on there. Sometimes the name is the maker. Sometimes it's the owner. Sometimes it's, documenting a line of descent. But, whenever we look around this room that I'm in right now, 90% of the objects have no name associated with them. And so what we do then is we try to compare it with other objects that do survive, sometimes with, let's say an ownership history, or, sometimes even a documentation of a bill of sale. And then you can start piecing together who people are. That takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. And, I don't think there's some undiscovered trove of signed Mary Adams pots somewhere. I think we would find them, but we just have to keep working, and we keep having to try to find these women in whatever way we can.
Yeah, and I think something that's becoming more evident is that as we do more research, we uncover more about people. I'm thinking of the Thomas Comerall exhibition recently, where Comerall, who is a Black potter working in New York, was previously thought to be a white maker, but then doing the diligent research, it was uncovered that he was actually a Black maker. And now we're starting to uncover a large body of his work. And that's becoming more and more prevalent. We're very excited that we just acquired a Comerall pot ourselves, late 18th century one. So that's one of those gaps that we're starting to fill in our collection, starting to identify some of those makers that we previously didn't know, or that have been underrepresented in institutions. So, and
as you know, it's always a partnership. The only way we've built the collection that we have, or the collection that the DAR Museum has, is thanks to people like those in attendance today who care, and who place those objects under our stewardship. So if there's something that you know of that represents a story that you want to see remembered and taken care of, then reach out to us.
Yeah,
we're all part of this together.
Yeah, it's fun working together.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Lea, for taking the time today and sharing with us your research on female makers and the treasure trove that is the MESDA collection. If you're ever down in Winston-Salem, I highly recommend going to MESDA and checking out the museum. If you can't make it down there, definitely the website, the Craftsman database, is also a treasure trove. I use it very regularly. The collection is also available online too. You can see all the amazing things that MESDA has collected over the years on the website.
Chance to talk with you guys today.
We will be posting this, I believe, on YouTube in the near future. So if you would like to go back and listen to Lea's presentation or this lovely Q&A, feel free to check out our website or our YouTube page for more. If you're interested in further events, lectures, other programming at the DAR Museum, also go to dar.org/museum to find more. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.